Well, we've reviewed a few Star Wars Legends novels so far, so I decided perhaps I would review something that was canon for a change. I randomly stumbled into Master and Apprentice, which is a novel by Claudia Gray that follows a mission that Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan went on 8 years before The Phantom Menace. I was kind of interested in checking this out because the story of The Phantom Menace has so much going on that after they find Anakin, the relationship between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, one which I thought was a tad undercooked since it was watered down with Anakin and Jar Jar, could potentially get a little more fleshing out here. Qui-Gon seemed like he had something boiling below the surface a little bit, but we never really got to find out what that was. So I used my monthly Audible credit, and a few weeks later, here I am. Before I start, I'm going to drop a spoiler warning. This book is very good, and it's a standalone. If you want to read it or listen to the audiobook and come back, I wouldn't blame you. But if you want to hear about the book, listen on. Gray set the book in 40 BBY, which makes it the earliest canon material we have looked at so far in my quest to review random Star Wars stuff. This is notably during the era before the Return of the Sith, which was an event that happened when Darth Maul showed his presence during the Phantom Menace. The book is something of a soft sequel and expansion to ideas covered in Claudia Gray's 2017 short story of the same name, which saw a Force ghost of Qui-Gon appear to mentor his former apprentice Obi-Wan during the events of A New Hope before Obi-Wan, or Ben Kenobi, introduced Luke to his future Jedi path. We may talk about this eventually since the book is part of the From a Certain Point of View book series, which seems kind of interesting. It follows numerous characters around the time of A New Hope, and later they did one on Empire and Return of the Jedi, and further explains events from the film in new canon-based tales. Regardless, after this, Claudia Gray was tasked with expanding her writing based on the pair of characters, and so we got Master and Apprentice. As I stated, this novel takes place in 40 BBY, a solid time before the events of the core trilogy, and 8 years before the Jedi discover Anakin Skywalker on Tatooine. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan's relationship is on the rocks a bit, with both Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan questioning if they're the best match as Master and Apprentice. Qui-Gon gets an easy out with this, however, as he's invited to join the Jedi Council, and with Obi-Wan still being years away from graduating into a Jedi Knight, he'd be reassigned. But before Qui-Gon has time to ponder this, he's sent to a world which is being attacked by terrorists, Pygel, which is currently under watch by a former colleague of Qui-Gon and Count Dooku's former apprentice before Qui-Gon, Rael Averross, who went on this near-decade-long assignment following the death of his own Padawan, Nim Piana, who died under his watch on a mission several years earlier. He protects the young, orphaned princess of the planet, Fannery, a 14-year-old who's about to be crowned the monarch of Pygel. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan quickly realize this planet may be more of a mess than they initially believed, as the terrorists that were running around the planet were a performance arts group called the Opposition, who were primarily peaceful protesters, and that much of Fannery's power would actually be under the influence of the Zerka Corporation, which has used slavery to source their labor, all while the planet was creating a treaty that would see Zerka gain ultimate power in the region and allow the company's shady practices to thrive. While trying to sort out the mess through the tension of their fledgling relationship as master and student, they run into a pair of mineral and ore smugglers, Rahara and Pax Marifer, who the pair quickly find out are more than a couple of mineral smugglers. Rahara actually grew up as a slave to the Zerka Corporation before escaping their custody, and Pax Marifer, who she has an uneasy romantic relationship with, was on a ship raided by pirates as a kid, and as a result was basically raised by protocol droids as every other human was killed. The four quickly bump into another organization, the Blackguards, who are immune to lightsabers due to faux kyber crystal-like gems that can create lightsaber-blocking shields. The Jedi are saved from the group by the Opposition, who they initially thought were terrorists, though proved themselves to be trustworthy. Taking their findings to Rael and the Zerka Corporation proved fruitless, as everyone decided it was the Opposition hoping to end the hyperspace treaty and didn't really pay much mind to the Blackguards. Around this time as well, Qui-Gon starts having visions of the coronation ceremony for Fannery, which has terrible tragedies unfold and rejuvenates his interest in the Jedi prophecies, which he studied heavily as a Padawan. Eventually, however, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan prove the existence of the Blackguards to the rest of the group, but Rahara is recaptured during the scuffle between Zerka and the terrorist organization, which has Pax lost in his mind, knowing that the logical thing to do is for him to leave, but he personally wants to save her from custody. Soon the coronation happens, and Qui-Gon's visions were proven correct, though Fannery, who he feared would be targeted, wasn't. Rather, Fannery was targeting Zerka and aiming for unlimited power over the region, enlisting her loyal bodyguard Darren and her friend Katie, a Zerka slave, to lead her army of blackguards. Obi-Wan is seemingly in danger, about to be killed by Darren, with Darren in a lightsaber-proof guard uniform. But Obi-Wan's lightsaber pierces through Darren's armor, as it turns out they replaced his Kyber crystal with a dummy Kyber, which is similar in weight, so Obi-Wan wouldn't detect the weight change, and this faux Kyber turned out to be effective in piercing the shield despite being weaker than the standard saber. Darren is arrested, but Fannery and Katie get away, threatening to bomb Zerka's ship with the flagship of the Pygel. However, the Zerka ship, which was pulling out of the planet, was full of 300 or so innocent slaves on top of other Zerka employees. Blinded with rage, Fannery was going to destroy the ship to the chagrin of Qui-Gon and Avaros, but is stopped by Katie as she was fighting for freedom for Pygel and the Zerka slaves, and seeing that Fannery has fallen too far and just wants power, decided to betray her former queen. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan enlists Pax to board and neutralize the Zerka ship and save Rahara, but Rahara manages to create a full revolt, which allows the slaves to hijack the ship and become legally free due to the Republic laws on unrest during planetary power struggles. The day is saved and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan leave the planet, and in the coming weeks, the planet becomes a legal democracy and part of the Galactic Senate. Fannery is under house arrest until she's 18 and was sent off to hopefully one day be an active member in the future of Pygel. Pax and Rahara made it off planet with a gift from Qui-Gon, which will help them recover some expenses and help them start a new life. And Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon working together as master and apprentice, moving forward into their further journeys with the Force. In the epilogue, Rael is approached by Dooku, who hopes to make him a student again, this time in the way of the dark side, but he declines, instead going back to Coruscant to again be a Jedi Master. Finally, the book cuts to about 8 years later. In the moments before Qui-Gon's funeral, the first Jedi cut down by the Sith in generations, and Obi-Wan is unsure of what Qui-Gon hoped to gain from the prophecies. Unsure if he was correct in so quickly throwing his training aside for Anakin's, but realizing that he made a promise to his mentor and friend Qui-Gon, and that he would train Anakin, in spite of his worries and the fact that he is still a pretty unexperienced Jedi to be taking on a Padawan. It's a melancholy ending, but adds a bit to the Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan relationship and further explores why he took Anakin on shortly after becoming a Jedi Knight in a trial by blood against Darth Maul. The novel features many members of the Jedi Council who were a little bit more than extras in The Phantom Menace, as well as Yoda and Mace Windu. We also get some small appearances from Dooku, a few in the form of flashbacks from the time of Qui-Gon's training, and we even got a brief nod to Maz Kanata and her cantina on Takodana from the sequel trilogy. We also see the Zerka Corporation, which originated in Legends, working from the time of the Old Republic mostly. The company here has been implied to be around for generations, though not much is known about them in canon besides what we see here. However, besides them, and obviously Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan, many of the other characters are wholly original to the book and super well made, with each character being pretty unique, and I personally got into each of their arcs pretty heavily, so let's explore that a bit. Qui-Gon Jinn is definitely the primary point of view in this book, with us seeing the world through his eyes. His views on the prophecies, his master's former apprentice Rael, Obi-Wan, and of course his relationship with his master, all of which eventually comes full circle, and by the end, he has an understanding of where he wants to go with his journey with the Force for the rest of his life following the book. Qui-Gon is rebellious, a Jedi which stands in direct contrast to his Padawan, Obi-Wan, and he questions whether or not they are the best match, and if Obi-Wan would be better off with another Jedi. Dooku, his master, was always pretty lax with the rules, so he saw them as blending well together, though by the end he realizes perhaps he and Obi-Wan's differences is what makes them a truly good match. He has an easy out joining the Jedi Council, but also questions if he'd be in a good position on the council, noting that he could do some good by adding different ideas and playing devil's advocate in his role on the council. And despite considering taking on the promotion, he ultimately declines after realizing he and Obi-Wan need each other, and that, due to his vision coming to pass, he may be the newest prophet of the Jedi, seeing that the ancient Jedi prophecies may be something that will guide his life with the Force moving forward. He also sees Rael Averross's fall from grace and failure to detect the deception from Fannery as an important lesson. Lots of stuff happens with Qui-Gon, and I really enjoyed spending time in his head. Qui-Gon isn't a different character than the one we saw in The Phantom Menace, but he's definitely easier to flesh out and understand when we're in his head. Being a quiet, stoic Force hippie is great, however in The Phantom Menace, him being quiet and stoic makes him fail to be really well examined as a character. Much like a character like Thrawn, that what's in his head is more interesting than what's actually being shown. I found Qui-Gon to be much more interesting as a literary character than a film star, and I really enjoyed him in this book. Obi-Wan in the novel is frustrated by his master in the way he acts. He also feels a level of abandonment when he learns of his master's offered promotion, a promotion that Jedi almost never turned down, with it never happening for a number of centuries by the time of this novel. Obi-Wan is even younger and more whimsical than he was in the original films. This allows us to see a more rebellious Padawan who goes behind his master's back, questions his training, and one who almost has some fun in his role as a galactic protector. He relates in a way to the slightly younger girl Fannery, which has him open his trust up to her too much to the point where he shows her how his lightsaber works, which he used to sabotage it despite it eventually saving his life. As the novel goes on, he finally learns to appreciate his master and his teachings, and understands their different ideals may help them keep each other alive in the future and teach each other to be better Jedi. The new characters are also well thought out by Gray, with Rael Averross, Dooku's previous apprentice before Qui-Gon, being an interesting addition to the lore of Dooku and Qui-Gon. Rael was always Qui-Gon's rebellious older brother. Being one of the older recruits to the Jedi Order, he has much more connection with his pre-Jedi life than most. This in hand also makes him more likely to bend the rules, with him smoking death sticks, and even having one-night stands with women, which is interesting since the concept of sex is nearly never tackled in the Star Wars universe, but Rael does it quite a few times in this book. Rael is not a bad man or a bad Jedi, but is lost, especially since his rebellious nature caused the death of his Padawan, Nymphiana, when she was corrupted by a slicer dart and he was forced to kill her. This is something that weighs on Rael, and ironically causes him to merge the new young girl in his care, Fannery, with his old Padawan, to the point that it created a silent divide between the pair. He failed Nym to the point that he was overprotective with Fannery, and ironically, that ended up making her bitter, which caused the whole issue of the novel in the first place. Qui-Gon shows him he needs to clear his mind, forgive himself, and follow the light, with Rael at one point considering leaving the Order, and even further floating around the idea of going rogue with Dooku, but ultimately returning to the Jedi with a new understanding of his life and relationship to the Force. Not sure how you could fit this guy in a future novel, but it might be interesting to see him in the future. I wouldn't mind getting more from him. Fannery is another interesting new addition, and when it turned out she was kind of manipulating the planet of Pygel in an attempt to crown herself the queen and get rid of Zerka, I was genuinely surprised. The book does such a good job of guiding you to Zerka being the evil force, with the opposition being the obvious red herring, but the kind of triple twist that it wasn't the obvious red herring and not Zerka, and that it was actually Fannery, who seemed pretty innocent throughout the whole book, was pretty surprising. But then later on, some of the things that Gray had implanted throughout the book kind of come back and make more sense with the context of how she ends up in the book. I have predicted it might have been Rael who was doing stuff behind the scenes, but Fannery was a surprise and one of the best twists in Star Wars history in my opinion. Fannery starts by wanting to get rid of Zerka, but eventually proves she doesn't really care about anything but power, which I thought was interesting. Showing darkness in this universe is always a slippery slope, be it on a planetary power struggle or as a Jedi who gets corrupted to the dark side. Fannery is the key to the book's twists and turns, and the book remains totally unpredictable throughout. It's actually pretty surprising, hence the spoiler warning at the start too. Merrick Call is the up-her-ass leader of Zerka. In reality, she cares more about her status and isn't really all that interested in Zerka or anything else. She uses Fannery as a pawn, Rail as a pawn, and ultimately is just a stone-cold businesswoman looking after her own success and has very little compassion for anyone else. Rahara and Pax are the definitive B-story stars of this book, but it all kind of comes full circle with Rahara's uprising at the end, freeing the Zerka slaves. Rahara was born to Zerka slavery, and as a slave worked in terrible and dangerous conditions. This causes Qui-Gon to realize that slaves weren't actually that necessary and that Zerka had them merely because they had the power to do so. Rahara wanted to see Zerka's downfall and save the slaves while she was at it, and this led her to recklessly being recaptured during a battle when she hopes to attack Zerka out of revenge, and also created concerns in Qui-Gon on why the Republic allowed slavery at all. While the Republic did ban public slavery in their systems, it was allowed if they were brought into the system, and through loopholes, Zerka had slaves and used them in Republic-occupied space. After Rahara and Pax saved the rest of the slaves, the practice was 100% outlawed on Pygel, which obviously Rahara appreciated, despite more work needed to be done to fully end the practice. Pax is a sarcastic douche who was raised by protocol droids, and naturally shares some of their sensibilities, trying to live by logic at all costs, and acting a lot like a human version of C-3PO. Finally, he learns to act out of his own courage and goes to save Rahara, despite it being illogical, since technically he would quickly find a new pilot, and he had an out to just get out of there when Rahara was captured. When he saved Rahara, it was his human side finally shining through, which was a welcomed change and a pretty solid little arc for this side character. I thought Pax's origins of being raised by protocol droids was fascinating and made for an interesting character. Something that's kind of a fun writing exercise, like how do you merge the writing styles of a protocol droid and a human. It was pretty interesting. And the duo of Pax and Rahara, I think, taught Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon a lot and helped add some urgency to also liberating the planet of Zerka's generational influence on the world. Tonally, the book has some political intrigue as well as some fascinating character studies, some tragic moments, and some fun moments. I think it's kind of all over the place, but works very well. Unlike the Thrawn novels, I think it's harder to compare to the films because it's very much its own thing, but I really enjoyed listening to the book and I found it very engaging for me as a Star Wars fan, though I could also liken the tone to something like Star Trek in terms of how it handles sci-fi for the most part, which works for me. I like Star Trek too. Claudia Gray is an amazing choice to write Star Wars novels, and this isn't the last you'll be hearing about her on my channel. She brilliantly writes fights to be engaging and easy to understand, has a good grasp on established characters, and writes them in a way that aligned with how George Lucas seemingly intended for them in his Star Wars films, and also wasn't afraid to add new characters with some depth, be that Fannery, Rail, or Pax, or Rahara. Claudia has worked in the High Republic timeline a bit, and I think the fact that she's good at making well-written original characters makes me feel more interested in diving into that side series a bit. If you recall or have seen my Dawn of the Jedi review, you will see that I don't always mesh with original characters, and I think that problem can be compounded when there aren't established characters to lean on. I think here Gray proved that she has a literary knack for expansion, which I think works well with the book. I also respect Claudia Gray, however, for just writing a solid story. Overall, Master and Apprentice is good. Really good, actually. And I think in a lot of ways is even better than Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, or at least more unique. This may have been my favorite Star Wars novel yet, honestly, out of 4 granted, but I imagine this is just another solid random pick, and there's some crap yet to come and some more good stuff yet to come too. I think Gray expanding on Qui-Gon works super well and makes more sense of the character than Lucas's often airy take from the films, with him being a character that translates a lot better to prose in my opinion than on film. The new characters are great, and I wouldn't mind seeing a novel expanding Rail or having him show up in a TV show or something like Tales of the Jedi or whatever. As you can tell, no released art of the characters exists, so I kind of just made up some approximations. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, I got a good feel for them anyhow. This one seems to be a bit of a hidden gem to Star Wars fans who aren't super well versed in the novels. I'm not going to sit here and act like an expert by any means on novels. As I said, I've read 4 of them so far, but I think it's worth a check out if you're a Star Wars fan, or a Star Trek fan, frankly. It's available through Kindle as a hard novel, or if you're like me and prefer to listen, you can also check out the audiobook, which is narrated by Jonathan Davis, who's read numerous canon and legends novels throughout the years and does a really good job. He's also done some voices outside of the books too, like some audio dramas, and did voices in the Old Republic MMO. He's great. Anyways, I already started The Last Command, which will conclude the Thrawn trilogy, and from there, I don't know, I'll pick something later.